Apologies for the delay. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. I just wanted to say that I'm Callie Buckley from CAA, the Content Manager for Education and Intellectual Property. And we are already recording, which has caused a little bit of a time lapse. But just so you know, we will be recording this entire session and we will be sharing it later. And I just have a few little reminders for you. If you give me 1 second. If you could turn off your microphone when you're not speaking, that would be much appreciated, and it helps quite a bit with recording. And you may or may not turn off your video, that's up to you. We also have automatic transcriptions, so you can turn them on by going to the top, and you should see 3 dots on your screen. If you open up that menu, you can turn on the closed captioning. Today, we'll start by hearing from the directors of both CAA and AIC, the American Institute for Conservation. And then we're going to move on to a conversation with Dr. Nancy Odegaard and Dr. Francesca Baver, the current and former recipients of the Distinguished Award for Distinction in Scholarship and Conservation. Finally, we're going to ask you to present any questions that you would like. So we'll invite you to put your questions in the chat over the course of this conversation, and we can answer them later. Or you can show up later at the Q&A, and you can turn on your video, turn on your mics. You can also raise your hand either using the icon up top with the raised hand, or you can raise it physically, but we'll see you a little bit better if you use the icon at the top. So now I'd like to get started and introduce Meme Omokbai, the Executive Director of CAA.
Thanks, Callie, and hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. I am delighted that today, as a component part of our strategic plan, meeting the needs of all of our constituencies, this is the very first kickoff event taking place outside our annual conference. I'm also particularly excited because this is a result of ongoing collaboration with museum professionals and our affiliated societies. The CAA AIC Award for Distinction in Scholarship and Conservation recognizes outstanding contributions by those who have enhanced understanding of art through conservation. This award was first given in 1991 and has proceeded as a joint award since 2016 with AIC, the American Institute for Conservation. And so I'm delighted to introduce Errol Wentworth, the Executive Director of AIC.
Thank you, Meme. I'm so pleased to be here today. It's an honor to help celebrate Nancy Odegaard and the remarkable career she has shaped. I first met Nancy in 1980, shockingly over 40 years ago now, when we were both in training in the Anthropology Conservation Lab at the Smithsonian. I lost track of her for a time, regretfully, so I was really thrilled to find that she was serving as the vice president of both the AIC and FAIC boards of directors, when I first started as the executive director at the end of 2003. Nancy served as president of both boards for 2 years, beginning in 2005, and we had an amazing time rekindling our friendship and building a new professional relationship, and we accomplished a great deal as well. Those who have worked with Nancy know that the status quo is definitely not an option. I'm in debt to Nancy for all she has taught me over the years and in awe of her many outstanding accomplishments in conservation, education, research, publications, mentoring, advocacy. I could go on, but the event today pays respect, I think, to Nancy's intellectual curiosity, her wide-ranging achievements, and the large circle of colleagues and friends who surround her. Before I stop, I just want to say that in addition to the joint awards program that AIC and CAA share, we are ready to mark a 20-year anniversary for a program partnership. AIC has offered the Learning to Look workshops in conjunction with CAA's annual conference since 2002. So looking forward, the Learning to Look workshop being offered during CAA's 2022 conference is titled Nan Goldin's The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, Developing Best Practices in the Exhibition and Preservation of Slide Art. I'll warn you that registration for these workshops is really limited, and they fill very quickly, so I hope you can get a slot. AIC's 2021 conference is currently in progress and is in partnership with the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, fondly called Spinach. And the sessions and events continue all the way through June 24th. So there's time to check out all that's still to be offered. And once registered, you can also view the recordings of any sessions you may not have wanted to miss. And the link is in chat, so please do join us. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Callie to introduce my friend and inspiration, Nancy Odegaard. Thank you.
Yes, it's my pleasure to now turn this over to Dr. Nancy Odegaard.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Nancy, are you there?
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
You're a little bit quiet.
All right, I will speak up a little further.
That's great.
Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. I'm amazed at how many friends and colleagues are here with me today. I really want to thank the College Art Association for the award with AIC, and of course AIC I've been involved with all of my career. I'd also like to take this time to acknowledge that I'm here in Tucson, and this sits on the original homelands of Indigenous people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial, and it's really been my privilege to work very closely with objects spanning thousands of years from this area. But I also want to thank the mentors that I had that helped shape my own scholarship. Say Carolyn Rose, Mary Lou Florian, and Colin Pearson, but there are others. And truly, over many, many years, the workmates that I've had, the colleagues that have become very good friends, and obviously the students and interns that have been in this lab. I owe so much to everyone for what I know, because I wouldn't know it without all of these people. So thank you. Thank Francesca joining us.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can see you.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Callie, did you want to say something, or should I just jump in? Jump in. Okay. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much to my colleagues at CAA and AIC for inviting me to be part of this occasion, and also for this incredible opportunity to get to know Nancy better. I do not have the same fortune as Errol to have known you for this long, but from the exchanges that we've had over the past weeks, I really look forward to getting to know you better. So it is with great pleasure that I will very quickly sort of give a brief overview for those of you who don't know about Nancy that well, and then jump into some questions and into a conversation with you. So I just wanted to say that this award celebrates not only the longstanding connection between conservation and art history, but the ever-expanding interdisciplinary nature of both disciplines. And of course, I'm including my museum colleagues. Throughout your work, we are also celebrating the vital importance of considering the lived experience of objects and of persons who made them and for whom they're meaningful. Conservation pioneer George Stout used the metaphor of the three-legged stool to describe the interdisciplinary collaboration between scientists, art historians, and conservators. And that, if I remember correctly, is back in the 70s. And we have since moved far beyond those three legs, as you will see, especially through our conversations. Nancy, your work has served as a model of engagement with far wider range of stakeholders, including museum professionals of all kinds, tribal members, students, scientists, and scholars in numerous other disciplines. And I don't know how many legs we need for that stool. So you also tackled a much wider set of questions. So I look forward to digging into some of your experience with you and with the participants during the time remaining. So for those of you who are not that familiar with Nancy's work, I just wanted to cover a few salient points. You're an objects conservator who works primarily in archaeological and anthropological ethnographic collections. You've been involved in the field for over 4 decades with vast exposure to thousands of objects made of a great range of materials. You've experienced the conservation practices of many institutions, both in this country and in other countries, ranging from Latin and Central America to South Africa and even currently Iraq. You've had stints in the role of curator early on and have also covered, are also versed in materials science. So we will get into, during the conversation, to the ways in which you have, shared your scholarship through numerous publications, but I wanted to jump in with our first slide. Sorry about this. PowerPoint slide. Okay, can everybody see that? And just point to the fact that you've also made, aside from your publications, made a point of sharing your knowledge and the fruits of your very unique conservation education through a range of professional and public presentations and workshops, internships, and many other forms of mentorship of conservation professionals. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about that and also give us, at the same time, a glimpse of what being a conservator of ethnographic and archaeological objects entails. What are some of the questions and challenges that you're faced with? And we have a display here of some of that work.
I would say that a big difference in the kinds of collections that I've worked with has been volume. Anthropology-based museum collections, research collections are often huge in number. And that really speaks to preventive conservation and the role of working with that. I'll try to talk a little bit louder. I'm having a little trouble with my microphone. Sort of saying preventive conservation, working with high volumes of materials, integrating museum studies, and looking at a huge diversity of materials that cover many cultures, many times, periods, and many thousands of contexts has made it very different. I think when it comes down to it, though, I would say that for a profession that was originally built on answering and coping with aesthetic problems, or what were perceived to be aesthetic problems, my own experience has been that the aesthetics have rarely been the top priority, and that has shaped the kinds of collection, the kinds of work that I do. My role in most of my career working for educational institutions and university museums has meant that students and the role of mentoring and even holding classes has been a huge part. So I've really felt fortunate to be able to work with so many students and so many conservators at different points in their careers, and likewise visiting professionals that have hugely shaped how we do things and have allowed us to become inventive, to ask questions that haven't been asked before. So I feel like a busy conservation lab is a very exciting place to be.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next slide, which brings up an important moment, I think, or experience in your career, which is to have lived through and built up, lived through the build-up and creation of NAGPRA. And the experience provided an aha moment for you. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about that and maybe sort of reference some of the work that you have illustrated here.
Well, again, working with large volumes of collections, I have a passion for almost any materials. I especially love woven materials. After the law NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was enacted, it became a concern for me that some of the museum objects may have had pesticide residues. And while museums and museum conservators knew about this, we were mostly focused on the concern for the object changing texture, color, appearance. And the notion that a toxic item that posed a human health hazard may be returning to its cultural origins, that was pretty shocking. And that really led to a whole series of work with determining what kind of toxins were present, working with medical doctors and chemists and scientific companies to work with instrumentation that would help us determine what was present, what was the most of concern, and then working with tribal members to see if we could, in fact, remove some of these toxins. Along the way there led to additional questions, and up at the upper right picture, this is working over the last couple of years with the Heard Museum and a number of weavers looking at technology. But another key moment for me was in the early 90s, really late 80s, when a bit of frustration over this issue of what are we preserving? Are we just addressing aesthetic concerns? And so the object in the lower right is a fragmentary portion of a painted object that was excavated. The middle pictures show how I received it. And this illustrated a lack of conservation on site, enabling a better recovery and transport of difficult, fragile items. And the third picture in that sequence is illustrating how I could put it back together. What was astonishing was that while I could understand what the materials were from technical study, the pigments, the fiber, the technology that put it together, I still didn't have any idea what it was. And it was when a group of tribal elders came together that we were, through our the museum director, Hartman Lawaima, who was a member of the Hopi tribe at the time, and he's passed away, but he organized it so that I could explain what I thought had been, how the manufacture had gone. And it was after that that they suggested that it might be like the illustration, an object that may have resembled that. So it was going from a recovered fragment to an actual object, but the intermediary was really based on what a conservator can do and what a conservator can see. And it really wasn't about restoring it to any kind of original shape. It was about reading it and having that relationship that allowed for the discussion to be able to determine what it was.
I'm going to stop sharing that for a moment so we can see you a little bit too. I remember you're telling me that it was this object that also triggered your going back to your studies and to get a PhD, and that you ended up deciding to go to Australia of all places. And I was wondering what, whether you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I guess that could be a very long story, but I think that what was bothering me was beginning to bother me with the number of objects, and this particular object was really how do the how does the dominant colonial culture get to decide what we're preserving with an indigenous minority culture, and how does that, how do I make sense, how do I wrap my head around that, how do I make sense of that? And so the idea was to realize that there was a problem in just talking about painted surfaces. What are they supposed to look like? Well, conservator will go back and say, you know, you've got a binder and you've got your pigments and you've got natural pigments and artificial pigments, and you know how the painterly technique and so on. But there's a lot more to it. The context of making paint, applying paint, selecting paint color, all of these things are huge meaning, and we were fascinated by them. But it let me relate to this theoretical question of who's making those decisions about importance. And so I began kind of looking where to have discussions about this. And it was really at a time when repatriation was really not happening. These kinds of discussions were hard to find. And I noted that colleagues in Australia were beginning to share a concern in dealing with some of their Aboriginal collections there. And so dialogue started, and it seemed like a good fit. My major professor was Colin Pearson, who is noted for marine metal archaeology. And so that would seem an odd fit. But Colin was working internationally with people throughout the Pacific region on codes of ethics at the time. And so while from a material standpoint, we didn't share as much knowledge, on the theoretical and ethical perspective, we shared much, and I learned a great deal working with him. So that was really how that started, and really kind of led me to think about how we should be considering more than the basic, sort of name, date, artist, condition, and description. That we have to think about more and really go beyond sort of the fix and repair shop, or the focus just on Western sensibility, Western perspective, and begin to contribute to a larger body of questions than just our own. So those were the things I was after.
Thank you. Next one. Okay, so these are some images from another project that again highlighted the significance of the non-material aspects of certain objects, and about the importance of being in dialogue with different stakeholders. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about this project, which I think is still in process, if I remember correctly.
This project is very much in process. I joined a board called the Patronato San Javier in 2016, and have been working with them extensively on the preservation of the church you see pictured, which is Mission San Javier Dilbach near Tucson, that sits on the Tonatam reservation near the village of Wak. And this many centuries old church has tremendous artwork inside. And as I began working with the group, we began looking at a conservation master plan, which is underway. We're working with structural components and have teams working on that. We have worked closely with some of the art conservators. Up in the upper left picture, there's among the group there is Tim Lewis and Mathilde Rubio and Susie Moreno, and the other folks there, including Ron Harvey, our bell ringers, and local iron workers. At any rate, with a group of people, I began looking at the story of these bells. There are 8 bronze bells and 4 iron bells at this church. And to my knowledge, they've never had any attention. There's sort of a before picture on the lower left and after. We were able to take one of the bells to the conservation lab, and over a period of many months, worked out a kind of a treatment protocol. And we've begun treating the rest of the bells in place and giving them a new hanging mechanism. So on the far right, lower right, you can see one of the bells that has been treated in place and the other that is awaiting. So I'll back up and say why the bells, why now? Well, the 2 bells you see were actually hitting each other as they were rung. And the ringing is an incredibly important aspect of what goes on at the church. The bells are rung by bell ringers from the village, and they are not really used for the religious ceremonies as much as they are used as in communication with the village. So, for example, they're rung during feast days, and they're rung at funerals. And so during a funeral in particular, everyone in the village will know if the deceased is a child, a male, a female, or a very important person by the sound of the bells. So it occurred to me we had to be preserving the sound. So there was every aspect of the treatment that I was going to propose and the follow-up maintenance treatment that the bell ringers would do has to do with assuring them that I wasn't going to change the sound and that everything I did they would be part of. And so this has proved to be a lot of fun. It's led to other questions. The bell on the far left that we were able to take to the museum and develop a treatment actually hangs in a little building to the left, a mortuary chapel, and is not rung. And it turns out it's the bell from 1775 that hung at the Tucson Presidio. And after the Presidio went into ruin, the bell was given to the mission where it hangs. So now we have some knowledge and we can begin to compare these bells and try to figure out where they were made. And each of the bells has a name. You have to get some of the corrosion off and then you can determine the name. So working with the bell ringers, with the on-site conservators, with the help of Ron Harvey and one of our colleagues, and a group of people that are vastly interested from the Patronato Board. We've got a program now that we're hoping to share with people that are also dealing with church or mission bells. So this has been a kind of a different way to work as well.
That's fantastic. I know that we're sort of running into question and answer time, so I just wanted to very quickly give you a chance with this last slide. This is just an overview of some of your sort of some key publications of your many, but also to just say a few words about the project that you're working on currently, just as a little, spotlight on, or heads up on what's to come next.
Well, thank you. The reason the American Alliance of Museums little logo is there is I'm working on a publication, a book-length publication that I hope will be useful and of interest to conservators and curators, collectors, and collection managers. I've been with help earlier from the Winter Museum, some funding there, and the American Craft Council. I began a project looking at the nomenclature or anatomy of the parts of objects of art and basically domestic and decorative type things that appear in museums. And we're now coming into the final stretch of this publication. My co-author, Cherry Krause, and I have been working on sort of three-dimensional illustrations that are labeled with the vocabulary that is going to help some of us that get frustrated when we say, what's that thingy on the side called, or the whatchamajig, or the all of that, a whole list of words that we're familiar with that don't really tell us what it is. And so that's been a nice project that I'm now able to work on, and without sort of being so heavy. I feel as though a lot of the work that I embarked on with human remains and pesticides and the chemistry related topics were a little more intense. This project in nomenclature is a little more fun.
And it's just as a last point to add to that, it feels like that kind of more standardized or agreed upon nomenclature can also help when we get into databases or sharing data and all of the digital turn of our various endeavors. So Callie, I realize there are probably lots of questions out there, and thanks Nancy for talking to me, and please share with us what our participants are interested in as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for all of your patience during this. We actually had so many people that my computer started crashing, so my apologies. But yeah, we'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions for Nancy.
And how should they pose those? Are they just in the chat, or can they just unmute, or how?
You can either post them in the chat if you don't want to be seen or heard, or you can turn on your video and microphone and just start speaking. But Nancy, I also wanted to mention, you know, there have been so many stories in the news recently about both repatriation of objects as well as issues with human remains in anthropological departments. And I was just wondering, I mean, to be more specific, Penn had some objects that are now considered unethical to own, which includes a piece from a body from a young person that died in the 1980s move bombing in Philly, also ethnographic skulls that were used to really sort of promote racism in some way. And just now we're talking about the repatriation of the bust of Nefertiti from Berlin back to Egypt. So how do you feel looking at all these stories coming out now?
Well, it doesn't surprise me because a lot of it wasn't that people didn't have concerns or opinions. It's that nobody was listening, and perhaps it was difficult to imagine there was a concern. I think there are many sensitive things, and human remains are humans. So the sensitivity there is, I think, well understood and well placed. And it's just hard to have an excuse, I think, for disrespect for humans or human remains. But we do sort of unfortunately see that happen. As museums go through collections, one of the things that I'm really aware of is items that require special kinds of care or restrictions. And I think museums really do have to look at their mission and what it is what they're proposing to do. And if you can't or shouldn't be using items in a particular way, they probably shouldn't be in the museum house. They should be in the location where they can have the appropriate care. A lot of times, museums don't know, and this is where the dialogue becomes really important. Is museums don't know, and a lot of times, in my experience, cultural groups don't necessarily know where things are. They don't maybe have the representatives that have all the answers. So the whole point is, developing a relationship with the stakeholders, the community, the people that you're hoping to share knowledge with.
Yeah, and I think that kind of collaborative knowledge and participation is really important rather than sort of this colonial idea that we used to have with museums. It also looks like Lesley Paisley has a question. Lesley? There might be a little bit of lag with muting and unmuting.
Oh, here's, I think I saw a question of what was difficult object.
Sorry, just repeat the question. Or Nancy, could you read the question?
I think so. This question for me. Hi guys, it's Amy. I think while we're waiting for Lesley to figure out her mic, I wanted to know what, because you've done so much work in your career on so many interesting projects, but what was the most challenging? What was the most difficult?
Oh, I don't know what really would be the most difficult. There's a number of objects that in the course of my 37 years at the Arizona State Museum, there was actually an object, more than one, objects that were in need at the time I arrived. And I wasn't sure quite how to tackle the problem as presented. So they just had to wait. And so several times it's taken a long time to figure it out. And then figuring it out meant that it just took, very little time at all. But it was slow. One involved that I sort of think of is it was a painted surface, and the paint was flaking off, and it had dried. The paint had been made with laundry bluing, powdered laundry bluing. And so it was basically the starch particles with the synthetic ultramarine that made the laundry bluing that were holding it together. And I was able to reactivate that starch with just a little bit of humidity focused with a nebulizer, and then it worked all right. In another case, I had some fiber that was so fragile that I didn't know how to get at it and release it from soils from an excavation, and in that case, really had to wait till we had cyclododecane available to us to finish that treatment. So I think that when things are really, really difficult, so if you have the opportunity to wait safely, you should wait until the mechanism, the product, the technique, the solution comes to you.
Thank you. That was an interesting answer.
And I'm still having some trouble with our Teams application. So if you have your hand up, please raise your voice and ask your question.
I can also take over as moderator with the chat, Callie, if that'll help. So Luke asks, could you talk a bit about your work in Iraq and how it related to your work at the Arizona State Museum?
Okay, well, the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Heritage is a longstanding organization. Right now, the Smithsonian is playing a big role in the ongoing efforts there. It's a training facility, and in 2010, I was invited to teach a course over there, some sort of basic science and spot testing. And after that, I joined that board and have been working on curriculum integration, funding, and there's a wide group of people that have helped immeasurably in guiding and in teaching on the ground over there. So the work I've done there has been ongoing with an effort to help in a place where war has made a done a huge amount of damage to cultural heritage.
Okay. And another, if people are having issues with the raise your hand icon or tool, please put your question into the chat. There's multiple ways to ask questions. Another question from Jennifer Lee. What made you choose to work in the anthropologist conservation field compared to any other conservation field?
Gosh, well, I had plenty of art history and had studied in Europe as an undergraduate, and imagined that I would stay with those materials. But right after graduating from undergraduate, I was able to take a position in Guatemala and really became enchanted with the objects that were still in play with their culture. I guess it would be a simple way to answer that, that these things, the development of craft and the use of objects in daily life and in culture was fascinating to me. And so and I felt there was a need. I think most of us that within the age can well remember that similar objects could be in an art museum and look very um, pressed and polished against their linen background, and be nearly the same object over in a natural history museum stapled to the wall. So I felt a need to go in and help out, I guess you'd say. So in that regard, it was just a fascination with the diversity and the cultural connection to those types of materials, and that's where I landed up.
Yeah, you had mentioned in a conversation we had previously that what drew you to your work is the humanism part of it, seeing the stories and kind of the traces of lives in these objects. And so to me, that makes perfect sense why you would be in this field. But it's kind of interesting as well, when in our previous conversations, you've talked about your work with art objects. And I know at CA we have a lot of art historians, and I'd be interested to know, another question from me, somehow your work has sometimes intersected with art museums and art history, and maybe if you have a good example because I know there is definitely contemporary artworks that have organic matter from human bodies, and I'm wondering if you were ever brought in to talk about those.
Well, I'm aware of that, but I have not been brought in on that topic. But there have been contemporary pieces that where something like botulism in display of jarred food, something like that could be a problem. There's a number of hazards to working to collections, and that's something that I've had some experience with. But I would say that in kind of crossing over the art field, I was often with the technical study is where there's a lot of overlap. Technical study is rewarding and collaborative and fun. I was so impressed. I was on a committee with a doctoral researcher, Kristen Kostland, looking at late medieval Norwegian altarpieces, and her discovery by reading objects, really has changed fundamentally what was the standard art historical uh, read of those objects, and changed the attribution and the background. So that's a great example. Our own experience here with at the University of Arizona with stolen de Kooning painting, and my as a conservator being asked to determine if it was the painting that was stolen. And really, it's not that I had an expertise in mid-century paintings on canvas. It was that I knew there were treatment reports early on, and I could, using my background, know how to read a treatment report by another conservator and could imagine the aging properties of whatever they had used. And so I was able to see things on the back that nobody else was looking at.
Well, so speaking of paper conservation, Lesley Paisley, she put her question into the chat. There's a little bit of context, so I'll read it. And I know we're running a little short on time, but because we started a little late, I hope it's okay if we run a little over. but so please stay with us. So Lesley writes, I'm a retired paper conservator, but when working in Hawaii at the PRCC, recall several instances where the objects conservators had to deal with issues related to working on sacred objects. A Hawaiian elder took on the spirit of the artifact so it could be treated and then returned the spirit to the artifact afterwards. Many objects carried a strong aura felt by all of us in the lab. Have you ever had to deal with this sort of experience?
Well, not exactly the same, but yes, I would say that, where I live, Arizona has 23 tribes in our state. We have visitors and drop-ins and appointments and any number of people that come, and the experiences are unique, the questions are unique, the exchanges are unique. It's always rewarding. So the opportunity, I'd say, to be with the person that created something, and I think in terms of the art historians working with working with an artist in contemporary art or in time-sensitive art, or some of these areas where you do have that opportunity to speak with someone with direct knowledge, is always incredibly rewarding.
Of course, that's fascinating. Okay, so maybe I have time for 2 more questions. So Mira asks, Mira Friedlander, how do you see the field of conservation, anthropological conservation, growing in the future? It's pretty broad, but.
Well, I think we'll be looking at a lot of the materials, probably approaching objects and items and belongings and the richness of collections from a bit of a more forensic eye. I think less looking for a problem as deciphering what is the question or what kinds of dialogue can we add to the body of knowledge. So maybe a little less reactive to what's perceived as a structural or surface problem, and maybe a little bit more what can we see and talk about that helps us better understand how something was made, how it was used, how people feel about it, how it is possible for it to transcend time and still be meaningful.
Right. It seems like you think the future will be more humanist in a way.
I hope so.
Yeah. So I'm going to read one more question and then I'm just going to carry it home, Callie, just because just in case. So you mentioned your passion for weavings. This question is from Jazz Graff. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the materials of the weavings you've worked with and if the patterns designs are part of the research and contextualization of the pieces. For example, specific designs, motifs that place them with tribes, peoples, locations, resources, a segment of time in which it was made.
Oh, absolutely. So I would say a lot of experience with basketry and basketry fibers, even basketry impressions. So looking at that as a technology, as a material choice, as a design field, as an opportunity to see handedness. What I love about woven things is that the level of detail is almost endless. Many people will look at design and color and kind of stop and pattern and look, sort of stop there. I really have found it really enjoyable to look further at the processing, how an artist or a craftsperson will begin an item, how they'll end it, and particularly when I can see a problem, how they solved a problem in got around it. And that could be almost in any material, but it's rewarding to see it in woven materials, where in the archaeological record it's minimal number, and they're often fragmentary, so you are missing a lot of the detail. What I like about some of the contemporary weavings is that it's not static. People are not necessarily doing what they thought was a tradition that has to be maintained. They're inventing new things, new designs, using new colors, creating new forms that allow them to express themselves.
Yeah, I can imagine weaving is it's such laborious process that every stitch, every loop, it's kind of a record of that process. And it's interesting to see how that record changes over time. That's really interesting.
And the whole dyeing process too.
Exactly. The choice and then because conservation is so interested in how things deteriorate and change, it's really looking at. I've often tried to suggest that people look at when they see something, are you looking at a damage or deterioration, and is that damage from use, or in other words, is there sort of an acceptable level of damage that is important to preserve because of the context, the famous person that did the damage, or the person that made it, or the people.
Right, and it's so many objects at our museums are the ones that survive because they were not used every day, right? They're extremely valuable and owned by an elite, and so you don't get to see that use and that trace, really. So that's really interesting. So I wish we had more time. We're already over. I'm just going to put a couple links in the chat there's 3 links. There's one about CAA and AIC and more information if you're interested in joining either of these great organizations, and also a survey for you to give us an honest account of your experience today. Again, I wanted to apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning. As Callie said, Nancy is just so popular that her fan base crashed her Teams application. So if anything, I think of it as a good thing. But I just wanted to thank Nancy and Francesca and Errol from AIC for putting this together, and really just congratulate Nancy on this award, and just thank you so much for joining us today. I'm a big fan.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And congratulations again.